This is the Blaze and Access podcast, amplifying disability perspective one story at a time. I'm Blaze Bryant. To kick off our Black History Month series, I couldn't think of a better person to join me than my dear friend Anita Cameron, who has been involved in the disability rights and justice space for nearly 40 years. Recently, Anita started her own venture called We Were There Too, amplifying Black disabled voices in the disability rights movement. It's really good to have you on the show, Anita. I can't believe I've been doing podcasts this long and we've never had you on, so thanks so much.
Thank you for inviting me. This is really great. Yeah.
Of course, the pleasure is mine. So, how did you get involved in the disability rights space?
Well, disability rights was probably the last big movement that I had gotten involved in. I've been involved in social justice movement since 2016. And, I was involved in various movements in the peace and justice arena, did a lot of, anti-nuclear war work, a lot of anti-apartheid work, immigration work with homeless and houseless people, LGBTQ work, because I'm a member of the queer community. And then at the age of 21, I accidentally, if you will, got involved in disability organizing and activism. It so happened that I was visiting my godmother and she received a phone call and she put the call on speaker, and the person calling was wanting to know if she knew someone who could be an assistant, an interpreter for a disabled guy who traveled around the country. And I listened, and, my godmother got more details. And when she hung up the phone, she looked at me and said, "Hey, Anita, your life is an adventure." It was. Oh, trust and believe me, it was. And she said, "Your life is an adventure, Anita. Why don't you call this guy up, talk to him?" And so we did. The gentleman's name was Dennis Schreiber, and he was deaf, blind, and he used a wheelchair. And he worked at the Chicago Lighthouse for the Blind. But he ran a group that was a sister chapter to ADAPT. And his group was called Disabled Americans Rally for Equality. And we were all ADAPT members, except it was so huge in Chicago that we had a contingent that lived on the north side and a contingent that lived largely on the south side. And that was myself, Dennis, and those guys.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, backing up, so I made the call to Dennis. His wife, Jackie, interpreted for him. Dennis used tactile communication, finger spelling, but he didn't use American Sign Language. He used a form of sign language called Sign Exact English.
Interesting. I've never heard of this.
Yes, with Sign Exact English and with finger spelling, you have to be a very good speller. And so during the interview, Dennis gave me a spelling test, and he was very surprised when I passed the test 100%.
Fantastic. Did you feel like you were in school at all during that interview?
Kind of, yeah, because he gave me another test because he couldn't believe that, and I know what it was because he said, I am a product of the Chicago public school system. I'm Black. Dennis was, a white guy who had his own ideas and thoughts about the public school system, and particularly the Chicago public school system. So he gave me the test the second time, which I passed. He then gave me a third test, which I passed. At that point, he hired me on the spot
Wow.
and then sent me through the process to be hired on at the Chicago Lighthouse for the Blind. And it was really interesting working with Dennis. We fundraised for ADAPT and for Chicago ADAPT. And Dennis was a money bag, and he was known for because he made a big deal donating, large amounts. And he did this by selling buttons. And when I was not at the lighthouse, I was selling buttons with Dennis. But we traveled a lot. And one of the most amazing things that we did together was I remember watching from afar the deaf president now protests, vigils, and whatnot that was going on at Gallaudet.
Right, which was the
And
first school for the deaf, in case people don't know.
yes, and they were fighting for a deaf president because up until then, Gallaudet had never had a deaf president. A new person had just been appointed. She was the provost. She was not a very popular person at all. And once again, she was hearing. And the students, they just wasn't having this, anymore. And I remember when, the protests started, when the vigils, when they were camping out on the campus and whatnot. And I remember Dennis and I had gone to an ADAPT action. And after that action, a couple of days later, we went to join the students and to be with the students. And I learned a lot because I was born with multiple disabilities, but I was not raised around disabled kids. And so it was only when I joined ADAPT that I was around other disabled people. And so there was a lot that I didn't know. And so, I went down and, talking to the students, it was like, I didn't realize that deaf people could drive, that, deaf folks did, everything hearing folks did. I did once I got back home to Chicago, I started taking sign language courses at Chicago Hearing Society. But then I was with Dennis for a year. And at the end of that year, I met Wade Blank. He came to Chicago. Chicago ADAPT had one of our big meetings, and he came to join us, which, he had done for the past couple of years. ADAPT was very new. When I joined in 1986, ADAPT was like 3 years old.
Right, and Wade was one of the founding members of ADAPT in Denver, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. But Wade went to divinity school in Chicago in my old neighborhood. Wade had marched with Dr. King on Bloody Sunday. Well, he was scared. He had a roommate who, because Wade supported Barry Goldwater, he accused Wade of being a racist. And, Wade, was like, absolutely not. And his roommate said, well, come with me to Selma. And they did. That was Bloody Sunday.
Right.
And then he went on he was involved in the protests at Kent State where students died. And that kind of rocked him. That rocked his world. And he wound up in the ministry, which he wound up losing his church in Chicago and whatnot, and wound up in Denver at a nursing home as an activities director for the youth wing at a nursing home called Heritage House. Now, there was a movie made about this. It was called When You Remember Me. It starred Ellen Burstyn and Jeff Savage. And Jeff Savage played Michael Patrick Mills. Actually, his name was Michael Patrick Smith. But, Hollywood, they have to change names.
Of course. Yeah, I'll have to check that movie out.
Yeah, it was nominated for an Emmy because of Ellen Burstyn's performance. And Kevin Spacey played Wade Black. Like I said, they changed names.
Right, to protect the identity of the person.
Yeah, I guess they also changed the name of the nursing home because the nursing home threatened to sue if we use the actual name. So the nursing home in the movie's called Hesperia House. In an odd twist of fate, that nursing home was shut down and Atlantis bought the property and turned it into apartments, like mixed income apartments and stuff like that. I think Atlantis still has that property, but the story, Wade, and how those folks, got out of the nursing home was the premise of it. Michael Patrick Smith wrote a book of poetry called When You Remember Me. That's where the movie gets its name. Michael was a poet, and I actually have a copy of that somewhere in my Adapt treasures.
Of which you have many. Anita Cameron is my guest here on the Blazing Access podcast. I want to go back to Adapt and when you joined. Obviously, the disability rights movement was then very white, and it still continues to be very white. What was it like? How were you received entering into this activist organization?
Well, so Wade, as I said, he had that background. A lot of the original members of ADAPT had been either peace and justice activists or had been members of various groups. So, for instance, we had Black Panthers in ADAPT.
Wow.
Yeah, we had at least 3 Black Panthers that I know of offhand, one whom I was very close to in ADAPT. We had people who were part of CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. So a lot of the white folks had either been members of CORE or other anti-racist groups, civil rights groups, who had joined ADAPT. And so Wade in particular welcomed me. I have to say that ADAPT was the first organization that was truly integrated. All of the other organizations and movements that I had been a part of before I joined ADAPT, I was either the only disabled person or the only Black person, or both, the only disabled, only Black. And so when I joined ADAPT, our chapter in Chicago, we were, especially that South Side crew, we were very mixed, Black, white, Latino. And on the North Side, the group was primarily white, but we came together often, because we were ADAPT. On the South Side, the group was primarily Black and Latino with some white folks. So it was very integrated on the South Side. And that was, that Dennis's crew. And I was fortunate in that Chicago was a very strong chapter and still is. And so a lot of the strong ADAPT folks came out of Chicago. However, I was not one of them. I was a very quiet, mousy young lady who barely spoke above a whisper. And for the first few years I was in ADAPT, people really didn't know my name. They knew Dennis. And so I was often called the little girl with Dennis.
I still find that very hard to believe, by the way.
Everybody does. You're not the only one. And I remember Bob Kafka used to tell me, yeah, you were the little girl with Dennis. And I was that little girl with Dennis until I came out to Colorado. I got hired by Wavelength, not in Denver, but in Colorado Springs. I was co-director of their learning center. So I was teaching independent living skills to folks. Our learning center was very new. And I guess myself and my team did really good. We were always in the paper and on TV and whatnot. And I was asked to come into the office to organize for ADAPT. And so, that's what I did back then. Well, I mean, Wavelength in particular groomed me for leadership. I didn't realize it at first, but looking back on it, he was always teaching me things, always making sure that I wound up in training. So I got trained by Shell Trap, trained by like different people in organizing skills and whatnot. And as I became louder and whatnot in ADAPT, and there was a specific incident that led me to becoming the person that people know now. But as I, became louder and I became known for, loud chanting and singing, things of that nature, then, I was invited to, start doing kind of like leadership related things. And, I noticed differences, especially after Wade died.
In 1993, right? From a
Yes.
from a diving or swimming accident, I think it was.
Swimming, he went on vacation to Todos Santos, Mexico. It was Wade's first real vacation that he had in years and years and years. And she took Molly and the kids with him, took Lincoln and Caitlin. And on the day that they were to return, they went for a swim. And Lincoln asked permission to take a last swim before they went to the airport.
Oh my
And
gosh.
he was given permission and went out to swim and was taken under the undertow. And Wade went to try to rescue him. And both Wade and Lincoln were carried under the undertow. They never found Lincoln. He was 8 years old. Lincoln was like a little brother to me.
Oh my gosh. That's awful.
And Caitlin and Molly are on the beach watching. There was nothing they could do. They did find Wade's body. The people of Todos Santos helped to get Wade back get him back home. But he died shortly after his 52nd birthday.
It's just awful. Here they were having this vacation they hadn't been able to have in years, and it unfortunately ended about as tragically as it possibly could. So, talk about that experience back to you and your leadership when you became the Anita we all know now.
Well, by this time, I was in Colorado, but I still work closely with Dennis. I worked closely with Dennis for several years after I moved to Colorado. When he would come, when he would go on adapt actions and whatnot, I was always his interpreter and his attendant. And I maintained my relationship with, my Chicago chapter. Anyway, we were in Sparks, Nevada. So I want to say Sparks, Nevada is just outside of Reno. And this was, I want to say 1989, I believe. Because I hadn't been in Colorado for too long. So it had been 89. And we were protesting the American Public Transit Association, APTA. And they would have conferences around the country. One time they went to Canada, and the JAP would follow them. We wanted to speak at their convention and meet with them because at the time the fight was for lifts on buses. And they never wanted to meet with us. Well, they were meeting at a casino, and I can't remember the name of the casino. It's kind of one of them sort of semi-famous casinos. And we got there, and when we get there, if we can't get inside, we're blocking doors from the outside. We're shutting you down. And I remember that it was very intense and whatnot. And by the time this happened, we had already been arrested a couple of times and ticketed. And they had told us that if we got arrested again, there was going to be some jail time. And so we got arrested again. There was a free for all in the courtroom. And the majority of us were sentenced to 3 days in the Washoe County Jail. And I was, one of them. While we were in jail, we had a protest, if you will, because we were not getting the things that we needed. This jail was brand spanking new, and it was accessible. It was literally accessible.
Imagine that.
Yeah, but we weren't getting the attendant services and all that we needed, and so instead there was a riot. In response, the jail punished several of us by sending us to the infirmary. And in the infirmary, we each had our own cells, and the cells, well, the doors are like these, I want to say about 3 or 4 inch thick metal doors.
Mm-hmm.
And we were each placed in a cell. And next to my cell was Gwen Jackson from Chicago. Gwen was unable to independently get water or things of that nature to drink. She needed assistance with that. And so they put Gwen in the room by herself. Gwen would beg for water, and I would hear her. If she begged too long, I would get on my intercom and ask the correctional officers to go and get Gwen some water. And they did this a couple of times, but then they got sick and tired. And so they began to ignore Gwen when she asked for water. And when I saw that, then I would ask on her behalf. After a while, they got sick and tired of me and they turned my intercom off. At that point, I became enraged and I banged on the door for about a good hour before they came. And when they came, it was not pleasant. They told me to get away from the door. And I said, "What are you going to do? Kick my ass?" And I demanded that they get Gwen water. Eventually they did, but they got sick and tired of me and decided to return me to general population. But that action changed me from, quiet, mousy Anita to loudmouth Anita.
Wow.
And so that was, the becoming, that was my becoming Anita story, if you will.
I love it. It's such a good story, and it shows just who you are, what you stand for, how much you believe in disability rights, justice, and autonomy. And it really is the story that, frankly, set the foundation for your career and success. I only have a few minutes left here, Anita, but very quickly, I want to talk about assisted suicide, a cause that you are deeply opposed to. And for disabled people, of course, it's a very important cause, I think, to be opposed to, because assisted suicide laws strip away freedom and autonomy. You worked for a long time with Not Dead Yet as director of community/minority outreach. Take a minute and tell us why this cause is so important to you, and what we can do to continue opposing assisted suicide laws here in the U.S.
Well, I feel, and it's certainly been shown, that assisted suicide, the laws in and of themselves discriminatory. They target a subset, disabled people, and they use the specter of dying in pain to hook you. But once you're hooked and brought in, then they reveal that it's a right to die situation, because these statistics from Oregon, which is the first state to enact assisted suicide, shows that the top 5 reasons that people want assisted suicide have nothing to do with pain, have to do with autonomy, has to do with the loss of dignity, their perceived loss of dignity, has to do with the not being able to do the things that you once could do and kind of mourning of that, the feelings of being a burden, whether a financial burden, an emotional burden, a physical burden on your family members. All of the reasons that people are wanting assisted suicide are things that can be addressed with services and supports and with actual real life, end of life care. And as assisted suicide is normalized across the countries, we're now at 13 states now,
I think you're right.
along with the District of Columbia. And as it's normalized, and as we are in situations where disabled people are losing their health care, we're going to see that disability discrimination that is going to put disabled people in a situation where they lose access to health care. They have a condition that is chronic that now, because you lost access to health care, is terminal. And then you're kind of slid into assisted suicide. And it's dangerous because there are no real guardrails to stop someone from a provider from misusing assisted suicide. The proponents say there's been no case of coercion and all, but how do you know when the mechanisms don't exist to track that? There have been some cases that have broken through. If we are not careful, and I've said it over and over, we're going to be in a situation where we're like Canada. And Canada has the most permissive assisted suicide laws in the world. In fact, they have euthanasia. And in Canada, they gear toward euthanasia. There's been a little over 60,000 deaths by euthanasia since they enacted their law in 2016. Doctors push it. They actively push it. And in Canada, you don't have to be terminal. And there are doctors, providers, entities in Canada working with entities here in the United States to bring that to this country. And in fact, Compassionate Choices, which was once the Hemlock Society, they are the main organization that is pushing this and pushing this. And you know what's really scary? And it's why I kind of look askance or look side-eyed at politicians. The very politicians who say that they support disability rights and programs for disabled also support assisted suicide.
Talking out of both sides of their mouth.
Exactly. And this is a situation where, and in my work, unfortunately, I've seen this. This is a situation where I've had to work with conservatives, with people who are literally MAGA, and all, because typically Republicans, conservatives do not support assisted suicide. They have their own reasons, but they don't support it. And so many of them can put aside their ideologies, if you will, and work with others who are against assisted suicide, including disabled, including folks of color, because we don't really want to talk about that with assisted suicide. But if you look at how discriminatory our healthcare system is, and that's baked in, the ableism and racism is baked into the system, we are going to see, as time goes on, communities of color being hit hard. Typically, communities of color do not utilize assisted suicide, but Compassionate Choices have been making huge inroads into the Black communities, into Latino communities, and working especially with people from the professional classes. They're getting inroads into this. Poor people, multiply marginalized people, we know, we remember how we're treated, by the medical establishment and disabled people, we know, that doctors don't, we don't have a quality of life. According to, if you look at the Harvard studies from 2021, yeah, it's a phenomenal number of how many doctors look at our quality of life, look at us as having a poorer or worse quality of life as someone who's not disabled. And so with all of that, it factors into assisted suicide, who's pushing assisted suicide. And as we're living through the criminalization of disability, the criminalization of poverty, of homelessness and houselessness, unfortunately, we're going to see that being utilized. If we're not careful, we're going to be in the world of Pebble in the Sky, where they had a situation called the 60, that on your 60th birthday, you went to a center and you were euthanized.
Oh my gosh,
And
I didn't even know about this.
This is Isaac Asimov, Pebble in the Sky. It's part of that vast Asimovian universe because, unfortunately, Isaac Asimov, despite all of the other good stuff he's done, unfortunately, he was a proponent of assisted suicide. He was a member of the Hemlock Society and embraced it. Interestingly enough, though, in this book, Pebble in the Sky, the protagonist is horrified with this and horrified with this culture. And so it was interesting that he was able to, even though, this was something he was into, he was able to write it from the protagonist's point of view, showing really the horrors, what this can turn into, because in that world, if you did not perform the 60 and the authorities found out, not only would you be taken, your entire family would be taken. And you didn't have to be 60 years old to do the 60. One of the protagonists in the story, the family, the head of the household, is a farmer who's had an accident and now uses a wheelchair. And he's been hiding for years from the government because if they catch him, he's going to have to do the 60. He's going to have to die. Even though he's able to do things, the only thing he can't do is walk.
Wow.
And so they figured that if you become disabled and you cannot do the type of work that you were doing before, in this gentleman's case, a farmer, well, then you deserve death. You were a useless eater, and you had to, as a duty, turn yourself in to be euthanized.
Jeez.
And like I said, if we're not careful in this country, in this climate that we're living in, it's been really rough. We've had Delaware, Illinois, now New York,
California.
Yeah, but California strengthened theirs. And that's what happens is that every state that has an assisted suicide law, they go back in and they expand the legislation, which basically means they get rid of guardrails, if you will. So in the original legislation, you had 15 days between the request for assisted suicide and the approval. Now, that could be as little as 48 hours, and in some cases, the same day.
Wow.
So, yeah, so you had to, the original laws were you had to have two doctors sign off on this. Now, one doctor and a provider. And the provider doesn't even have to be a doctor. There's no requirements, or very few requirements for psychological evaluation. And even in the states that have it, what you get 15 minutes, you get an hour. How is that enough time to really determine, mental health situations going on? And if you've just been told that you're terminal, it would seem to me that it's normal to become depressed, and all of that. What you should be getting is, mental health treatment, is palliative care, is all of those, especially if it truly is end of life. Because a lot of times, I tell the story of my mom who lived in Washington State right after they enacted their assisted suicide law. She was determined to be terminal. She was placed in hospice. That doctor did everything short of open his mouth and tell my mom, about assisted suicide. But he hemmed and hawed and did everything. But my mom was in hospice for 6 months. And she left hospice because she decided she wanted to go home to die. And we made the arrangements. Sent her back to Colorado, set her up in her own apartment, set up the visiting nurses and attendants. And she basically waited to die, except she wanted to do a couple of things for her bucket list. And one thing for her bucket list was she wanted to go to Washington, D.C. and get arrested with her daughter.
That's fantastic. I love that.
So 6 weeks after she came home to die, she was in Washington, D.C. with me getting arrested. At that point, she decided, maybe I'm not going to die. And she didn't. She died on February 1st, 2021, 12 years after she was determined, to be terminal, and those doctors trying in their sneaky way, to get her to do assisted suicide.
Wow.
And my mom lived, to see all her grandkids grow up and get married, and go off to college. She lived to see me do some cool stuff. And, she didn't, thank goodness that she didn't, take the subtle, advice and all. She wouldn't have, lived all the time, that she did. And so I've become, really, to be honest, radicalized when it comes, to assisted suicide. It is too dangerous. It should not exist. And, I think that some things are being worked on that I'll be able to talk about later on down the line. But yeah.
Wow. And just to go back a little bit, Anita Cameron is with me here, Blaze Bryant, on the Blaze Nexus podcast. 72% of doctors from that Harvard study do not feel comfortable treating people with disabilities. I've got a couple minutes left, Anita. Quickly plug your new venture, We Were There Too, of which you are the proud executive director.
We Were There Too, Blacks in the Disability Movement, is the culmination of a Twitter rant that I went on back in 2015, because the year-long celebrations of the Americans with Disabilities Act did not really include the contributions of Black disabled Americans. And so I wrote a Twitter rant, which led to a blog post that went viral. And I named names of Black folks. And a couple of years later, as I continued to write more about it, I got funding from Borealis Philanthropy to do, to do the program. So the project is at www.wewerethere2.org, and there's a couple of stories that are highlighted. It tells about the project. I am actually in the process developing some merch and developing a couple of more stories. And I've been asked to have the project be part of a curriculum for disabled folks who are new in advocacy and activism. And so thanks for allowing me to get it out there. Once again, it's wewerethere2.org, and stay tuned for merch and for YouTube and TikTok channels to come.
Anita, Cameron, thanks for being extremely generous with your time. I know you are a tremendously busy human being, and I greatly appreciate the history lesson and the stories. And as always, it's a pleasure catching up with you here at the podcast and in real life. Let's do this again soon.
Definitely. Let's do it again soon. Let's talk about emergency preparedness for people with disabilities. I just got my ham radio license, and KE2 HIW Kilo Echo 2 Hotel India Whiskey is my call sign. And yeah, let's talk about how those of us with disabilities can help each other out in times of disaster, in times of emergency.
Absolutely. We'll do this again real soon, Anita. Thanks again for the time. It's always a pleasure chatting with you.
Thanks, same here, Blaze. You have a great one.
You too. This was part 1 of our 4-part Black History Month series, Amplifying Black Disabled Voices in the Disability Rights Movement. The Blazing Access podcast is a Blazing Shows production and is not affiliated with any disability rights organization. The views expressed here on the show are solely those of the host and the guest. The show is hosted and produced by me, Blaze Bryant. The music you heard on today's show is by Andre Lewis, who is blind. What did you think about this episode? Let me know on Facebook at Blazing Shows. That's BLAISIN Shows. Make sure you rate, review, subscribe, share, and support the show if you can on our website at blazingshows.com. Transcripts are automatically generated and are not perfect, but they will give you a baseline sense as to what was said here on the show. Tune in next time for another great episode of the Blazing Access podcast, amplifying disability perspective one story at a time. Have a great day.